All right. Okay. My humble greetings to all the devotees in New Zealand. It's so nice to see you all again. All glories to this divine grace, Srila Prabhupada, our beloved spiritual master. I think the most important fact to remember about Srila Prabhupada in April of 1972, it was Srila Prabhupada's Leela. His mood was big adventure. It was Srila Prabhupada's most dynamic and active period ever to push Krishna consciousness all over the world in a very short time. I was the most fortunate person in the world to have witnessed and participated in this whirlwind period. Seeing Srila Prabhupada at his dynamic perfection, exhibiting his magic and unbelievable potency to the fullest degree. Srila Prabhupada had made one short trip to Australia in May of 1971, just 2 weeks. And when he returned to Bombay, I became his private secretary, his personal secretary, in June of 1971, and this hurricane began. The next day, we were off to Moscow, where Srila Prabhupada, despite every obstacle, planted the seed of Krishna consciousness behind the Iron Curtain in just 5 days' time. And what is now the huge tree of tens of thousands of Krishna devotees. And then he was off to Europe, and then the USA, and Africa by September, then back to India, then back to Africa, then all over India again. And then it was time to see unconquered lands, Australia, the Pacific Rim, far Asia. And this was the whirlwind atmosphere of that time. In my mind, Srila Prabhupada's artful perfection and his energy and potency were displayed in their highest form in two places, Moscow and Auckland. Given the very short time he was at each place, Srila Prabhupada's actions were so condensed and powerful and had such long-lasting, huge effects. It's hard to separate these two places in my mind. In 1972, in India, some devotees of a guru in Hawaii named Sai had surrendered to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was very fond of them. He could see their tremendous enthusiasm and sincerity. Two disciples, Tusta Krishna Das and his wife Tulsi Krishna Devi, were very fresh, exuberant, saintly people with the kind of big energy that Srila Prabhupada liked. They had a deep love for Srila Prabhupada, but they were still a little at odds or made uncomfortable by the ISKCON people at the time. So when they asked His Divine Grace if they could start a temple in New Zealand, he readily agreed and gave them all his blessings. So we were in Australia around, I think it was around the 1st of April in 1972. And Srila Prabhupada saw Tusta and Tulsi Devi there, and he immediately made a plan to go to New Zealand. I think it was we were going on the 14th of April and leaving by the 18th for Hong Kong. Just 4 days. I'd long given up asking Srila Prabhupada, is this enough time? As I recall, he had a fixed appointment with Dai Nippon Publishers in Tokyo. So everything was scheduled in short bursts to get him there to Japan on time, because the publications of his books took first priority. So on such short notice, we couldn't get enough seats on the same plane to Auckland. I believe it was from Sydney or Melbourne. So Srila Prabhupada went alone in one plane ahead of myself and Nandu Kumar and Pradyumna. As his secretary, and I was very disturbed by this because I was in charge of his travel arrangements. Srila Prabhupada alone on an international flight. We'd had many previous problems with customs and so on. Like the time we got all of us got thrown into a 2-week quarantine in Bombay for not having yellow fever vaccination. So I was really worried. But Srila Prabhupada said, don't worry, I came to you alone. And Krishna is always with me, so there's no question of alone. So we got to the Mount Eden place in Auckland, and so much work had been done in such a short time. Srila Prabhupada noticed that the paint was still wet in places. And walking around the small garden there, Srila Prabhupada was impressed that both apples and oranges, or maybe it was mangoes and apples, I don't remember, grew in the same yard. He said, just see the perfect climate for Krishna to flourish. This place is blessed with every fruit, tropical and temperate. When he arrived in New Zealand, I could see that Srila Prabhupada was energized by the presence of so many inquisitive and intelligent Westerners again. After many months in Africa and India, here was a Western audience again, and he got the chance to use his favorite tools, logic and argument. He loved that Victorian town hall. I just reread Kurma's book, The Great Transcendental Adventure, and reread those lectures. My God, how Srila Prabhupada hit his stride. Srila Prabhupada at his best, belting out with obvious authority and perfect logic, saying just the right things. Of course, he always did this, but New Zealand was a particularly powerful display because the people were ready. They were ready for him. They were hungry to hear him. And using his practical examples and logic, he overwhelmed me with these lectures. And I've been hearing him lecture every day for almost a year. But it was cold. I remember that. Srila Prabhupada covered with blankets, sitting there in his little room, reading and talking with devotees and strangers and well-wishers every moment of every day, nonstop. And did he love the butter and the milk? He commented on them constantly, the butter and the milk. He had never tasted such. I remember Aksoyananda, though I believe he wasn't actually there, but I remember him as such a nice New Zealand devotee whom Prabhupada loved very much. Jagatarini, so many wonderful devotees were there. I especially remember Srila Prabhupada's lecture to the artists at that art gallery. I had never heard Srila Prabhupada speak about art before. Krishna, the supreme artist. Everywhere the devotee sees the artistic hand of Krishna. It was so moving and perfect. And later, when we were discussing the lecture in his room, Srila Prabhupada asked me to transcribe it and make it into a small book, Krishna, the Supreme Artist. And then the installation of Radha Giridhari. It was typical that these early installations were always hurried, and because we were all totally inexperienced at this sort of thing, quite often they were accident-prone and humorous, really. For example, the deity installation at Berry Place in London. The columns fell, and Srila Prabhupada wound up holding up Lord Jagannath to keep the whole thing from collapsing. But I remember the Auckland installation as being particularly hurried, with disaster threatening constantly. And yet how sweet it all was, and how serene Srila Prabhupada was in the midst of such chaos. How the ceiling burning, and the cramped space, no oxygen, the lack of preparation was totally ignored by Srila Prabhupada. And their lordships serenely standing in their new home, smiling at us all. Years later, I believe it was 2004, I returned to your wonderful temple there in Auckland. And I was so happy to see so many wonderful devotees and such a nice home you have created there for Sri Sri Radha Giridhari. I could feel Srila Prabhupada's bliss deeply pervading the temple, the devotees, and all of your devotional activities there. So I'm very much privileged and honored and humbled that I'm still around to remember Srila Prabhupada's amazing pastimes in New Zealand with you. And I offer you all my deepest, best wishes on this 40th anniversary. 4,000 years from now, the world will still remember Srila Prabhupada's incredible pastimes in New Zealand. All glories to His Divine Grace, HG Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.